What would you do if the world around you froze solid, and every warm meal you had ever known suddenly became nothing but a memory? Would you cling to your morals, your sense of right and wrong? Or would the ache in your stomach slowly drown out everything else people like to believe they know themselves? We imagine we would stay strong, that we'd rather perish with dignity than compromise our humanity. But hunger does not ask for your permission. It gnaws, it hollows, and it remakes you into something you don't recognize. I remember the first time I felt real hunger, not the kind you fix with a quick drive-through stop or skipping lunch during a busy day, but the kind that settles into your bones, the kind that whispers with every heartbeat, "Feed me, or I'll tear you apart from the inside." It was during a winter survival exercise, years ago. We were a group of young men, full of pride and bravado, believing that strength alone could outlast nature. The first day in the mountains was almost fun, a test of endurance. The snow crunched under our boots, the air burned our lungs, and the thrill of challenge kept our spirits high. By the second day, when the food ran out, jokes still passed around the campfire. Someone laughed about chewing bark, another about boiling shoe leather. But by the third day, the humor vanished. Conversation slowed. Our lips cracked from the cold, and our hands trembled not from fear but from the sheer exhaustion of burning more calories than we had left to spend. There is a moment when hunger transforms from discomfort into obsession. Your mind betrays you. You no longer dream about banquets or backyard barbecues. You think about texture, about chewing something, a stick, a strip of cloth, anything that might fool your body into thinking you've bought yourself another hour of life. And then comes the whisper, the quiet, relentless question, "What would you do if this goes on?" That whisper is the real enemy. It's the same voice that haunted pioneers snowbound in the mountains of Nevada, that stalked sailors stranded on shattered rafts in the open ocean, that echoed in the ears of young rugby players trapped in the Andes. It's a voice that doesn't care about laws or religion, family or loyalty. It only cares about survival. Standing there in the silent wilderness, my ribs pressing against my skin, I realized something that history has shouted at us for centuries. Survival is never noble. It is raw, desperate, and often horrifying. And when men and women have been pushed to the edge of starvation, they have done things that once seemed unthinkable. The question isn't if it could happen, it's when and to whom. Because when you are staring down the abyss of starvation, you discover that the line between morality and instinct is thinner than you ever imagined. Tonight, we'll step into those stories. Stories where ordinary people no different from you and me were trapped in conditions so extreme that their very humanity was put on trial. These are tales of frozen mountains, endless seas, and communities abandoned in their darkest hour. Stories that ask a simple, terrible question. What would you do to survive? On October 13th, 1972, a small chartered plane lifted off from Montevideo, Uruguay, carrying a rugby team, their friends, and family members, 45 people in all, bound for Santiago, Chile. It was supposed to be just a short flight across the Andes. For most, it was an exciting adventure, young athletes with a bright future, laughing, joking, unaware that history was about to turn them into one of the most haunting survival stories ever told. High above the mountains, the weather shifted, clouds thickened, turbulence rocked the fuselage, and snow whipped against the windows. The pilots miscalculated their position, believing they had already crossed the most dangerous peaks, but they hadn't. In the thin mountain air, the plane clipped a ridge. Metal screamed as the wings tore off, and the fuselage bounced like a toy down a slope of ice and rock before sliding to a stop in a frozen valley. Some died instantly in the violent crash. Others were thrown against the broken walls of the cabin. By the time the survivors gathered themselves, 33 remained alive, injured, bleeding, and stunned by the silence of the Andes. They were surrounded by mountains rising like walls, a prison of snow stretching endlessly in every direction. At first, they believed rescue would come quickly. Radio stations announced that a plane had gone missing. Surely helicopters or search parties would spot them. They rationed the few scraps of food left in the wreckage, a handful of chocolate, a jar of jam, a few bottles of wine. Each person received a morsel so tiny it hardly touched their tongues. Still, they clung to hope. But days passed. Search planes flew overhead, but the white fuselage blended perfectly into the snow. The survivors waved, shouted, even laid out debris in the snow, but the planes kept flying. At night, temperatures plummeted below zero. The wreckage provided little warmth, and the thin air burned their lungs. Hope began to thin with the rations. By the second week, reality sank in. They were stranded, deep in the Andes, with no food, no supplies, and no sign of rescue. Some prayed. Others wept quietly. Hunger gnawed at them, twisting their stomachs into knots, leaving them too weak to stand. Their bodies shrank, their lips cracked. Each day, someone else grew too weak to move. That's when the unthinkable became the only option. It began with whispers. Someone suggested what no one dared to voice: the bodies of the dead were preserved in the snow. There was protein, calories, the very essence of survival, lying all around them. The first reactions were horror, revulsion. These were teammates, friends, brothers. To cut into their flesh felt like a betrayal of humanity itself, but the alternative was slow starvation. In the end, survival won. The first cut was the hardest. Strips of frozen flesh, pale against the snow, carved from those who had already died. Hands shook as they passed the pieces around. Some refused, shaking their heads, their stomachs turning. Others wept as they placed the meat to their lips. But one by one, hunger silenced morality. They chewed, they swallowed, and they lived. The days stretched into weeks. Each morning they woke expecting to die, and each night they prayed for rescue. Avalanches thundered down the slopes, burying parts of the fuselage and killing more of their companions. The group shrank further, forcing the survivors into even more desperate measures. They fashioned sunglasses from scrap plastic to prevent snow blindness. They melted snow for water, using pieces of metal warmed by the sun. And they continued to eat the flesh of their dead friends. After more than 2 months, the survivors realized no one was coming. If they wanted to live, they had to save themselves. 2 of the strongest men, Nando Parado and Roberto Canessa, set out to cross the mountains on foot. They carried little more than makeshift sleeping bags, scraps of flesh, and sheer determination. For 10 days, they climbed peaks and trudged through valleys, their bodies emaciated, their feet raw and bleeding. At last, they stumbled upon a Chilean shepherd, weak and delirious. They begged for help. Within days, helicopters arrived. Out of the original 45 on the plane, only 16 survived to be lifted out of the mountains. The world was stunned. When news broke of how they had survived, many recoiled in horror. Headlines shouted the word cannibalism. Moral debates raged in newspapers, pulpits, and living rooms. Were these young men monsters, or were they simply human beings forced to make a terrible choice? The survivors themselves spoke openly. They said it wasn't a choice at all. They hadn't eaten out of cruelty, or madness, or ritual. They had eaten because they wanted to live, to see their families again, to walk under the sun one more time. One survivor said, "When you are starving, nothing else matters. The flesh of my friends became the only way to honor them because through them, we lived today." The crash of Flight 571 is remembered not only as a tragedy, but as a brutal lesson in the thin line between civilization and instinct. It has been told in books, documentaries, and even Hollywood films. But no retelling can fully capture the despair of standing in that valley, staring at the mountains, and realizing that the only way forward meant stepping into the realm of the unthinkable. The Andes disaster reminds us of a truth: most of us will never have to face survival strips us down to our core. And at that core, when hunger roars louder than morality, we may all find ourselves capable of choices we never believed possible. Long before a chartered plane broke apart in the Andes, another group of desperate travelers faced their own reckoning with hunger on the other side of the world. This was America in the mid-19th century, a land buzzing with the promise of opportunity. The Oregon Trail and the California Trail lured thousands of pioneers westward, promising fertile soil, gold, and a new beginning. Families packed wagons with everything they owned, chasing a dream across endless plains and jagged mountains. Among them was the Donner Party, 87 men, women, and children who set out in 1846 from Springfield, Illinois, bound for California. Their wagons rolled slowly across the continent, creaking over prairies, fording rivers, and grinding through desert heat. At first, their spirits were high. They sang songs, traded jokes, and looked ahead to the life they would build in the Golden Land. But the Donners made one fatal decision. Instead of following the established trail north, they chose a shortcut promoted in a guidebook, the so-called Hastings Cutoff. It promised to save time, but it turned out to be a merciless detour through salt flats and rugged mountains. The wagons bogged down, oxen collapsed, tempers flared, weeks were lost, and supplies dwindled. By October, snow began to fall in the Sierra Nevada. The towering peaks that guarded the entrance to California became impenetrable walls of white. The Donner Party, exhausted and starving, found themselves trapped near what is now Donner Lake. Their wagons were half buried, their cattle dead or scattered, their food stores almost gone. At first, they tried to ration. They boiled leather hides into a kind of gluey soup. They chewed bark from the trees. Children sucked on bones, hoping for a taste of fat that wasn't there. Each day the snow piled higher, cutting off any hope of escape. Winter locked them in a prison of ice. As the weeks dragged on, desperation deepened. People wasted away, their cheeks hollow, their skin yellowed with malnutrition. One by one, the weakest died, and just like in the Andes, the whisper of survival began to creep into the minds of the living. The bodies were preserved in the snow. Food, of a kind, lay all around them. The decision was not unanimous. Some refused, clinging to faith or morality. Others wept as they gave in, driven by the sight of their starving children. They cut into the frozen flesh of neighbors, even kin. In those moments, civilization disappeared, replaced by the raw instinct to keep breathing. When a small group of the strongest, later called the Forlorn Hope, set out on snowshoes to cross the mountains and seek help, they carried with them not just courage, but also the grim burden of cannibalism. They trudged through blizzards, frostbitten and skeletal, sustained by the flesh of those who had fallen. After 32 brutal days, they stumbled into safety. Their story shocked California, but it also spurred rescue efforts. Back at Donner Lake, the survivors endured months of horror. Rescue parties eventually reached them in waves, but by the time the ordeal ended, only 45 of the original 87 were still alive. Families had been torn apart, children orphaned. The snow melted in spring to reveal the full truth of what had happened in those cabins, and newspapers across the young nation carried tales of cannibalism that horrified and fascinated the public. The Donner Party became legend, a cautionary tale about ambition, poor decisions, and the merciless indifference of nature. But beneath the sensational headlines lies the same question that haunted the Andes survivors more than a century later when death closes in and survival demands the unimaginable. How far will a human being go? For some, the Donners were a disgrace to the frontier spirit. For others, They were simply human beings caught in an impossible trap, doing what was necessary to keep their children alive. History remembers them with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. To this day, the name Donner carries the weight of that winter, a reminder that the American dream was sometimes bought with blood and bone. And just like the mountains that entombed them, the story endures a frozen monument to desperation and to the thin, fragile line that separates humanity from instinct. If the mountains could trap people in snow and turn them into desperate survivors, then the sea could be even crueler. On the open ocean, there is no shelter, no firewood, no game to hunt, just endless water stretching to the horizon and a sun that burns by day, freezes by night. And in 1816, off the coast of West Africa, the sea delivered one of history's most infamous survival nightmares, the wreck of the French frigate Medusa. The Medusa was supposed to be a proud symbol of France's return to power after the Napoleonic Wars. Bound for Senegal, it carried nearly 400 soldiers, sailors, and officials, but the ship was commanded by an incompetent captain, a political appointee with little real experience at sea. His arrogance and poor judgment drove the vessel into disaster. The Medusa ran aground on a sandbank far from shore. Panic erupted. Lifeboats were too few, and those who managed to claim seats were mostly officers and the privileged. The rest 147 men and women were forced onto a hastily built raft made of masts, planks, and rope. It measured barely 20 meters long, yet it bore almost 150 souls. The raft was unstable, half submerged, and entirely at the mercy of the currents. At first, there was hope. The officers in the lifeboats promised to tow the raft toward the coast, but within hours, the ropes were cut. Whether out of fear, cowardice, or cold calculation, the lifeboats abandoned the raft to drift alone on the Atlantic. What followed was 13 days of unrelenting horror. The first night, waves crashed over the deck, sweeping dozens into the sea. By morning, only about 120 remained. Rations were almost non-existent, a few casks of wine and barely any food. Hunger and thirst set in quickly, driving men to madness. By the third day, fighting broke out. Drunken sailors mutinied, slashing at their companions with knives and axes. The stronger killed the weaker, tossing their bodies overboard. The deck was slick with blood and seawater. To stay alive, survivors drank seawater despite knowing it would hasten their deaths. Some lost their minds, babbling and hallucinating as the sun beat down mercilessly. And then came the inevitable. When the rations were gone and the bodies piled on the raft, the survivors turned to cannibalism. At first, they cut flesh from the already dead, consuming it raw under the blazing sun. Later, they killed the weakest outright. The raft became a floating slaughterhouse, where humanity dissolved into instinct. By the end of the second week, only 15 souls clung to life. They were little more than skeletons, their skin blistered and blackened by salt and sun. Their eyes were vacant, their voices hoarse from screaming. When the French Navy ship Argus finally spotted the raft and pulled the survivors aboard, sailors recoiled in shock. The story that followed shook Europe. The survivors testified about abandonment, murder, and cannibalism. Newspapers raged at the incompetence of the captain and the cruelty of the officers who cut the raft loose. And when the French painter Théodore Géricault unveiled his massive canvas, The Raft of the Medusa, the public could not look away. The painting depicted the survivors waving desperately at a distant ship, their bodies twisted in agony and hope. It became both a political scandal and a timeless symbol of human desperation. What happened on that raft was more than a maritime disaster. It was a mirror held up to society. The privileged saved themselves. The poor were cast adrift. And in the chaos, stripped of law and order, men revealed what they were willing to do to survive. Cannibalism on the open sea was not new. Sailors whispered of it for centuries. But the Medusa's tragedy was different because it was public, political and undeniable. The victims had names, stories, and a canvas the size of a wall to remind the world of what hunger and betrayal had done. Today, the raft of the Medusa remains one of the most infamous survival stories ever recorded. It tells us that when people are abandoned, when they are betrayed by those in power, and when nature closes in with no escape, survival demands choices that leave scars deeper than the sea itself. The Andes, the Sierra Nevada, the open Atlantic each proved that nature can strip away civilization in a matter of days. But you don't need to dig through centuries of history to see this truth. Look at our own time. At disasters so recent we can still hear the voices of those who lived through them. In 2005, Hurricane Katrina slammed into the Gulf Coast of the United States. The storm itself was catastrophic, but what followed was worse. In New Orleans, levees broke and floodwaters swallowed entire neighborhoods. Families scrambled onto rooftops, waving makeshift flags for helicopters that never came. Supermarkets were stripped bare. Thousands of people huddled inside the Superdome. A stadium turned into a shelter of desperation. With no electricity, no clean water, and little food, the place descended into chaos. Rumors of violence, looting, and despair spread like wildfire. For days, people felt abandoned not just by nature, but by the very society they trusted to protect them. The richest fled. The poorest were left behind, forced to scavenge, to sleep on concrete, to wonder whether help would ever arrive. Hunger and thirst transformed neighbors into rivals. It wasn't cannibalism, but the desperation was written in every exhausted face, in every hand clawing for bottled water or stale bread. 5 years later, in 2010, the ground beneath Haiti convulsed. An earthquake ripped through the island, leveling entire blocks, collapsing schools and hospitals, leaving hundreds of thousands dead or wounded. Survivors clawed through rubble with bare hands, searching for loved ones. Markets and warehouses were looted not out of greed, but because hunger does not wait for order. Aid was promised, but roads were broken, airports overwhelmed, bureaucracy choking the flow of relief. For days, people drank from puddles, fought over sacks of rice, and buried their dead in mass graves. And in 2004, when the Indian Ocean tsunami swept across Indonesia, Thailand, and Sri Lanka, the wave erased villages in seconds. Those who lived through it stood among ruins, dazed, stripped of family and food. In some coastal towns, survivors fought over scraps washed ashore. The international community rushed in aid, but for those first days, before the planes and ships arrived, it was survival stripped to its rawest form. In each of these modern catastrophes, the same pattern repeats. Disaster arrives suddenly, systems fail, supplies vanish, and in the vacuum, hunger and fear take control. We like to imagine that modern society shields us from the nightmares of the past, that supermarkets and smartphones and governments will always save us. But when levees collapse, when buildings crumble, when the ocean swallows the land, those illusions vanish. The truth is that it doesn't take a century-long famine or a forgotten expedition to reveal how fragile our world is. It can happen in a matter of hours, in a modern city, surrounded by technology and wealth. And when it does, the line between order and chaos is just as thin as it was on a frozen mountain or a drifting raft. These modern disasters are not tales of cannibalism, but they are tales of abandonment. They remind us that survival isn't just about nature. It's about whether society chooses to remember you, or whether you are left to fend for yourself. And when the world turns its back, survival once again becomes a question of instinct, of will, and of how far you are willing to go. When I think back to that winter exercise, to the empty ache in my stomach and the snow pressing in on all sides, I realize how close I came to understanding what those people in the Andes, the Donner Party, and on the raft of the Medusa truly faced. My hunger lasted days, not months. I knew. Deep down, that help was coming. But even in that short window, I felt the whisper, that little voice asking, what would you do if it never ended? That's the thread connecting all these stories. Whether it was athletes trapped in the Andes, pioneers stranded in the Sierra Nevada, sailors drifting on the Atlantic, or ordinary families abandoned in New Orleans or Port-au-Prince, the same question rises in the silence of desperation. Survival is not a heroic anthem. It is a negotiation with your own instincts, a bargaining table where dignity and morality are often the first things sacrificed. History loves to judge. We call some survivors brave, others monstrous. We shake our heads at cannibalism, at looting, at the madness that hunger brings. But standing in the shoes of those people emaciated, freezing, praying for one more sunrise judgment fades, in their place, you would likely do the same. Not because you wanted to, not because you chose to, but because your body and mind gave you no alternative. And yet, within that darkness, there's something else. These stories also reveal a stubborn flicker of light. Think of Nando Parrado and Roberto Canessa trudging across the Andes to save their friends. Think of the rescuers who cut through blizzards to reach the Donner survivors. Think of neighbors in Katrina sharing what little they had, or Haitians pulling strangers from rubble with bare hands. For every act of desperation, there is an act of defiance against despair. That's the paradox of survival. It shows us the ugliest parts of ourselves, but also the resilience, the ingenuity, and the will to keep each other alive. The line between instinct and humanity is thin, but it isn't erased. Even in the midst of cannibalism and chaos, people still prayed, still sang, still believed in something beyond the hunger. So what do we take from this? Not horror, not disgust, but humility. The comfort of our lives, the warm meals, the full refrigerators, the confidence that help will always come. These are luxuries, not guarantees. And when they vanish, the truth of who we are is laid bare. If you remember nothing else from these stories, remember this: survival isn't about glory. It isn't about strength or pride. It's about endurance, about refusing to surrender to the cold, the hunger, or the hopelessness. And sometimes, it's about making choices you never imagined yourself capable of. I walked away from that mountain exercise with a new respect for the fragility of civilization and for the strength hidden in ordinary people. Because survival is not noble, but those who endure carry with them lessons that the rest of us must never forget. If you've stuck with me through all of this, through avalanches and shipwrecks, through blizzards and broken levees, you probably need a breather, because I sure do. Talking about hunger, cannibalism, and human desperation for this long will drain just about anyone. So maybe I'll end with something a little lighter. Back during that survival training, after days of shivering in the snow and pretending that melted pine needles counted as soup, we finally got brought back to base. And you know what the instructors gave us first? Not steak, not bread, not even a hot bowl of soup. They handed us plain crackers, just little squares of flour and salt. And let me tell you, those were the most glorious, delicious, unbelievable bites of food I've ever had in my life. I remember laughing with the others, half delirious, as if we'd just been served a 5-star meal. Hunger has a way of changing your definition of luxury. That's the lesson, isn't it? These stories we've explored of plains in the Andes, wagons in the Sierra Nevada, rafts on the Atlantic, and cities drowned by floodwaters. They aren't just history, they're reminders. Civilization is fragile. Food, water, warmth, safety, all of it can vanish in a heartbeat. And when it does, what we have left is each other and the will to endure. So take a moment tonight to appreciate your full stomach, your warm bed, the simple miracle of comfort. Because for countless souls across history, and even for many in our own world today, survival has never been guaranteed. Thank you for listening, for watching, for sticking through the heavy parts. If you found value in these stories, share them, subscribe, and join me for the next journey. Until then, stay safe, stay strong, and may you never have to hear that whisper of hunger for yourself.